Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. All of the excitement, all of the expansion of the Roaring Twenties came to a crashing end in our episode 1 of the Great Depression. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have 4 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to describe the prolific African-American artistic activity that became known as the Harlem Renaissance. You should be able to summarize the economic and social conditions of the 1928 election, identify the main causes of the Great Depression and Hoover's initial response to it, and you should be able to outline Hoover's attempts to address economic problems. Maybe academic problems? I think economic problems. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. Race relations were a constant flux in American history. That's been an ongoing discussion in this class. But in the modern era, with limits placed on immigrants from undesirable countries, even defended by pseudo-scientific theories like racial evolution, there was even a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. For however brief it was, it showed that the issue was unsettled at home. It having been pushed aside from mainstream white society, African Americans developed a strong black culture instead. That black culture is characterized by an upsurge of self-consciousness among black Americans, especially in the northern cities. Take, for instance, New York's Harlem neighborhood. It gained an international reputation as the capital of black America. The 1920s also became famous for slumming, or when white people visited Harlem's dance halls and jazz clubs and speakeasies in search of what they thought of as exotic adventure. In the imaginations of white people, Harlem was a place of primitive culture, and going into the nightclubs there was flirting with a certain element of cultural danger. Subpoint B, Harlem was the world's largest black area, city in really the world. Made up of black people from the United States, but also a pretty significant amount of immigrants from the Caribbean. Known as the Harlem Renaissance, an African-American literary and artistic movement expressed a certain pride in being black. The Harlem Renaissance carries the name Harlem, and it's named after that neighborhood in New York City, but it wasn't just located there. It was just kind of seen that's sort of the cultural heart of what it means to be a black American. But I want to introduce you to a few of the important members of the Harlem Renaissance. The first one is Claude McKay, who was a poet, and his poems urged black people to resist prejudice and discrimination. He was an immigrant from Jamaica, and Claude McKay expressed the pain of life in black ghettos and a life in a world dominated by white people. The next person I want you to meet is really one of my favorite American authors ever, a guy named Langston Hughes. He was born in Joplin, Missouri, just south of my favorite city. He lived in Kansas City for a time, and his poems describe the difficult lives of the working class. Now, when you read Langston Hughes' poetry today, there is like a rhythm to it that at the time felt like jazz music, almost jazz rhythms to it. It's beautiful writing that just sweeps the reader away in its pace and its rhythm to it. It's great. The next person to meet is Zora Neale Hurston. She was an African-American writer of the Harlem Renaissance who showed the folkways and values of poor Southern black people. She considered that the way of life that the poor unschooled African-Americans were living was really one of the greatest common wealth, cultural wealth of the continent. And she celebrated what she called the common person's art form. That was the ingenuity and the strength earned by surviving hard times. The Harlem Renaissance, a lot of these writers write for periods greater than the 1930s. We wouldn't say this is just a 1930s Great Depression kind of movement. It actually lasted for quite a bit of time, what we kind of think of as the years of the Harlem Renaissance. So if you go and research some of these writers, some of these artists, you'll find that they're active way beyond the scope of this narrow little slot of our A-Push class today. Subpoint C. The influence and the popularity of the Harlem Renaissance went even beyond black audiences. The musical comedy Shuffle Along launched the Harlem Renaissance. It was popular with white audiences too. It's one of our first great crossover hits where people in different corners of culture all appreciate the same thing. It featured the talents of black performers and won large followings even among white audiences as well. The next person I want you to meet is Paul Robeson. He was a son of a one-time slave. He was a major dramatic actor, international, London and New York, particularly in a role that as Shakespeare's Othello. Othello was often played by a black man. That's kind of the way that it appears to be written by Shakespeare. Although there is some interpretation that other people of other races might play the role of Othello. That's kind of its traditional understanding. And I'm not sure anybody was better than Robeson. He was an amazing actor. Subpoint D. Jazz. Jazz is probably the quintessential sound of the Harlem Renaissance. And it was born in the early 20th century, kind of in the city of New Orleans is where it first develops. But it spread across the United States at various times into Chicago, into Kansas City, my favorite city. It was seen as one of the cultural hearths of sound of jazz. And of course in New York. The sound blended ragtime and blues. It emphasized new rhythms. In 1918, really jazz gets introduced in the world when a musician from New Orleans named King Oliver, Joe King Oliver, he moved from New Orleans to Chicago, and he and his band brought that sound out of the South and introduced it to broader audiences in the North. One of the members of his band was a trumpeter named Louis Armstrong. He had been once a member of King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. And so Louis Armstrong is maybe among the most important single musicians in the history of modern music. He made personal expression really the hallmark of jazz, like the key piece of improvisation, of individual, how a musician is going to relate to the rest of the band or to the audience themselves. He improvised large parts of the performances where the rest of the band would just start getting back and playing beats and fills and letting Louis Armstrong kind of just play what he was feeling at the time, real true improvisation. He later moved to New York and he joined the Fletcher Henderson Band. It was the most important band in the most important city. Louis Armstrong remains the most important musician in jazz history. I would say arguably among the most important musicians in world history, certainly American history. Louis Armstrong, man, what a guy. Next person I want you to meet is Duke Ellington, Edward Kennedy Duke Ellington. He was a pianist. He was a jazz pianist. He was the leader of his orchestra, so he led, Duke Ellington's orchestra from the piano. He was one of America's really greatest composers. As a musician, he's a fine pianist, but he's really as a composer and as a arranger, introduced music in a lot of ways that was inaccessible until Ellington was able to remaster it and show off really the strength of various people in the Duke Ellington Orchestra. He easily crossed over between black audiences and white audiences through the 1920s to the 1930s. Duke Ellington was really one of the greatest musical composers in that era of American music, with Mood Indigo of 1930 and Sophisticated Lady in 1932. Along with Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway popularized improvisational singing, a style known as scat music, which used basically the voice like a musical instrument. It became one of the hallmarks of vocal jazz. It's still used today among jazz musicians. If there's a singer, then usually some portion of scat is one of those things that's going to come with the sound, where people began just spouting out notes, not recognizable words, but to play a song as if the voice, which is an instrument, but was a conventional horn instrument or something like that. The last person I want to meet before we move on to our next topic is Bessie Smith. Bessie Smith was a blues singer. So the division between blues and jazz is at various points in history clear and at various points kind of fuzzy. We might say in the 30s there's a pretty clear division between blues and jazz. And Bessie Smith was a blues singer, and she was considered maybe the best vocalist of the decade, black or white, man or woman. It was Bessie Smith. By 1927, she actually became the highest paid black artist in the world. Got to get those adjectives in the correct order. She had enormous popularity, major record company support. Bessie Smith just had a sound that spoke to people. Roman numeral number 2. Here I want to talk about kind of a sadder topic, and it's what would become really the dominating topic of this era of American history, and that's the economic conditions that we refer to as the Great Depression. And in 1928, there's a presidential election that comes up. It's a contested election on both sides because in the summer of 1927, President Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge, was vacationing in the Black Hills of South Dakota. He often liked to go to the Black Hills of South Dakota. He could be by himself. Coolidge was sort of a classic introvert and just kind of wanted to not deal with you. And he liked fly fishing and kind of being where people couldn't bug him. And he called a press conference to what was the Black Hills White House, where he was often at. He calls a press conference. Whatever press is in South Dakota came in to go hear his statement. They get a presidential briefing up in kind of the wilderness up there. When the reporters come in, Coolidge hands each one of them a little slip of paper with one sentence printed on it. It reads, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. And the reporters kind of looked at each other trying to figure out, like, I do not choose to run for president. Like, does that mean he's going to do it but he doesn't want to? Does that mean that, like, I don't choose to run president because I'm being forced to? Like, he's going to take 28 off but come back in 1932? Like, this was kind of a confusing sentence. And what none of them were expecting to go find out, after allowing the reporters to kind of take it in and mull on it for a little bit, Coolidge just, like, blurted out. He said, if I take another term, I'll be in the White House till 1933. 10 years in Washington is too long. It's too long. And then he kind of pauses and looks at the press and he says, there will be nothing more from this office today. And the press kind of like, okay. Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover had jumped at the chance to go run for president. Hoover seemed to exemplify exactly what America wanted at the time. He was widely the new era of American capitalism. The Roaring 20s went through the Department of Commerce, and it was Herbert Hoover at the helm of it. Coolidge was reluctant to endorse Hoover. He never really liked him that much. On one occasion, he remarked, for 6 years, that man has given me unsolicited advice, all of it bad. He just, like, Coolidge didn't really like Hoover that much. Subpoint B, who, though, but Hoover? Herbert Hoover grew up as an orphan child. By adulthood, he was a multimillionaire. He was a successful engineer with international practice. Herbert Hoover was a world hero because during World War I, he led the relief efforts that basically kept Europe from starving to death. 9 million Europeans received handouts through the hands of Herbert Hoover, which he did entirely without public support. He just, like, no government money. It was just, he got charities to go give him food and cash and was able to support a continent that way. Widely considered a genius at basically everything. Both political parties hoped he would be their presidential candidate. 8 years before, in 1920, Franklin Roosevelt even kind of commented, our best hopes for the future of the Democratic Party, our best bet would be to nominate Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover's opponent in 1929 was Al Smith of New York. Al Smith is governor of New York, and both Hoover and Smith actually pretty similar to each other. They had pro-business platforms and pro-farm ideas, and they were pro-immigration reform, and they were anti-war candidates. They were actually pretty similar on a lot of things. Without much to distinguish them, personal factors began to distinguish them, and Al Smith's Catholicism became the focus of the race. It's important to remember that while Catholicism is not like a weirdo religion today, it's a pretty mainstream religion, it wasn't for most of American history that way. Most of American history, Catholicism was kind of an other sort of religion. It wasn't like a mainstream religion at all. And Al Smith's Catholicism was the focus of that race. It was a somewhat obscure minority religion, and the two candidates were otherwise so similar that there wasn't much to distinguish them. Herbert Hoover had a promise. He said he promised a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. And with those promises and the sense that Hoover was kind of a mainstream candidate, he solidly beat Al Smith, carrying 40 states to the 8 that Al Smith carried. Roman numeral number 3. The superficial prosperity of the 1920s shrouded the weaknesses that would signal the onset of the Great Depression. Key industries such as railroads and textiles and the steel business, they'd hardly made a profit. Railroads were losing businesses to new forms of transportation, things like trucks and buses and private automobiles. Lumber and mining, they had expanded during the war, but after the war, their demand had really dropped sharply. One of the important economic indicators that declined during this time was housing starts. So housing starts is how many people are building new homes. It's actually really a still important economic indicator. When housing starts start to fall, so do jobs in a lot of related industries, things like furniture manufacturing and timber cutting, all of those things also take a hit. Subpoint B. Farmers were also needing a lift. Farmers, like so often in American history, had been in trouble. Farming made up 50 or so percent of the population of the country, and Coolidge just didn't seem to be able to help them out very much. He commented, he says, farmers have never made much money. I don't think there's anything anybody can do about it. During World War I, though, farm prices were rising and international demand for crops like wheat and corn had soared. However, after the war, demand fell and crop prices declined pretty sharply by 40% or more. Farmers, though, had boosted production during war times, and it was hard to turn off the tap, especially once they started losing money at the market. Like, demand is down and they're not making as much money, but they still have the capacity to produce so much. They say, well, I guess we're just going to need to plant more corn and more wheat and more crops because we're not getting as much per acre. Let's go plant more acres so we can go get enough out of it, but that exaggerates and depresses prices further as supply begins to way outstrip demand. Between 1919 and 1921, annual farm income was declining from $10 billion to just over $4 billion. Many farmers who had gone into debt during the war, they had suddenly difficulty paying off their loans. Many farmers outright lost their farms when the banks foreclosed and seized on property as payment. As farmers began to default on their loans, a lot of rural banks also began to fail. Like, just because the farmer goes out of business, they owed money to the bank, and the bank, like, suddenly they're not going to just magically get their money back just because they get the land back, because the land isn't worth as much money because farm prices are falling out of it. So banks now are starting to fail, and auctions were held to go recoup some bankers' losses. Subpoint C. A lot of Americans appeared to be prosperous during the 1920s, but the truth was that it was just appearing to be prosperous, and they were truly living beyond their means. They often bought goods on credit. Credit is an arrangement where consumers agreed to buy something now, have agreed to buy it, and pay for it later over time in small segments along the way, and those payments each have a little bit of an interest payment to it, like it's the fee they will pay in little bits along the way for the right to not pay up at front right at once. You end up paying more over time, but getting something that otherwise you would take you a really long time to save up for when you might need it right away. This was often in form of an installment plan that would include these interest charges. By making easy credit available, businesses encouraged Americans to end up piling up a pretty good amount of consumer debt. People then had trouble paying off those growing debts. Faced with debt, consumers just cut back on their spending. And a key theory of the slowdown of the Great Depression is that average people and investors really kind of caused it for themselves by taking on too much debt in an unsustainable system. Auto sales were also slowing down, and consumers had maxed out their installment plans. It wasn't uncommon for people actually to owe 100% of their net worth to others. Investors could buy stock on margin, and that fed rampant speculation. Speculation is a type of gambling where people would say, like, it looks like the stock market's doing good. Maybe I should go borrow money from the bank to go buy shares in stock. And, I'll buy them now expecting that the shares will be worth more in the future. And that's speculation, buying something now for the hope to sell it later at a greater profit. Subpoint D. But that stock market gambling wasn't... I was a wrong horse to ride. After a brief mini crash and a recovery, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is one way of measuring the stock market, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 13% on October 28, 1929. The next day, it dropped 13%. By November 13th, the market was down 50%. This is the stock market crash. This is when people suddenly they had bought something at a value expecting to go sell it later, and then it's not going to be selling for a higher value. It's going to be selling for less and less and less over time. And people begin to say, like, oh, I had bought shares expecting to sell it at a profit and it's losing money. I better sell it now because it's losing value. And if I don't sell it now, it's going to be worth even less later. And so it ends up being a really fast drop in value, and this is the crash. The crash alone, though, doesn't cause the Great Depression. It signals the start of the Great Depression, and it hastens the collapses of the economy, and it makes the Depression more severe. But the stock market crash doesn't cause the Great Depression. This is an important lesson, like beyond history. I'm going to set the notes here for a second. Beyond history class, this is just a piece of economics that you should know. The stock market is not the economy. There's times the stock market is doing badly, but the overall economy is doing fine. There's times that the stock market is doing awesome, but the overall economy is doing badly. Like the stock market is not the economy. They are related. They are important components of each other, but they are not the same. In this case, though, we would say that the stock market crash of 1929 it's not like it doesn't cause the Great Depression because the stock market is not the economy, but it's the signal that, like, oh, we're in a depression. Subpoint E. A common economic belief was that during hard times, countries should protect their own by raising tariffs. Essentially saying, like, whenever we fall on like economic instability, the way that we can prop up our economy is by putting tariffs on imports. That makes imports more expensive, and that means that American jobs Like producing American stuff is going to be better because American goods will look cheaper. People will buy American, and that helps Americans. That does not, like we're not trying to go help other countries with imports. So during hard times, you'll often find that the government switches to tariffs as a way of trying to spur their own economy on. It wasn't a universal belief, though, and I think we've talked about it in this class enough times that that's kind of a mixed bag to go have tariffs. Like sometimes it makes sense, and sometimes it's a really bad idea. There wasn't a universal belief, particularly among the growing study of economics. Despite 1,000 economists begging him not to, in 1930, Calvin Coolidge signs the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Excuse me, this is Hoover. In 1930, Hoover signs the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And when he does that, he essentially kills international trade. We're suddenly not buying anything from other countries. Other countries are like, oh, well, America drops a tariff on us. Let's drop a reciprocal tariff on them. And we end up, we don't do it. International trade just stops. U.S. trade partners retaliated by putting their own tariffs, which limited exports. By July 8th of 1932, the stock market had collapsed by 90%. After Smoot-Hawley, unemployment jumped. The stock market plunged again. The crash of 1929 doesn't start the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley tariff doesn't really start it. Both of them make it worse. By 1932, American unemployment rose to 23.5%. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans was out of a job. Just 3 years before, it was 3%. Now it's 23%. People feared mass starvation. People feared revolution. That's what comes when you have this kind of unrest. So point F. The Great Depression transformed American life. Hungry men and women lined the streets in search of work. In Detroit, 4,000 children stood in bread lines every day looking for handouts for food. Thousands of families lost their homes. They lived in shanty towns, which would become known as Hoovervilles. The image of big business, which had been so carefully cultivated during 1920s, had just collapsed as congressional investigation revealed massive irregularities among bankers and stockbrokers. For a time, cities saw decreases in population. People just left town for the first time that it happened in the United States. They moved to the country because they said in the country, at least we could try to grow our own food for our families. Rural areas, though, weren't any other escape for poverty either. There was, problems on farms, as we've pretty clearly established as well. The birth rate fell, the suicide rate became the highest in U.S. history, and what a mess. Roman numeral number 4. In 1924, Congress had approved, 1924, so in our last unit, Congress had approved a bonus payment to veterans of the Great War. So veterans who fought in World War I, in the World War, we're going to get a payment later. It's this was part of their compensation package for enlisting. Payable in 1940 had ended, and it was to be paid out in the form of cash and a life insurance policy. So basically, as the veterans were ready to retire, they'd get a bonus and a life insurance policy. But 1945 seemed like a long way off. The bad economy meant that veterans were desperate now, and many worried that they might not even live to 1945. So in the spring of 1932, between 10 and 20,000 World War I veterans and families arrived in Washington, D.C. from various parts around the country. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. It was a play off the American Expeditionary Force led into World War I. This was the Bonus Expeditionary Force. We remember it today as the Bonus Army. And what they were doing was they were watching on Washington because Congressman Wright Paxman, who was a Democrat from Texas, had introduced a bill in Congress to authorize the government to pay an extra bonus to these war veterans for their service. They were led by a guy named Walter Waters, an unemployed cannery worker from Oregon. The Bonus Army came into the nation's capital to go support the Patman Bill, to go show veteran support for the effort. Hoover was suspicious of this, and he claimed that these protesters, they're probably communist protesters. They're probably people with criminal records rather than actual veterans. They're probably just actors pretending, trying to go get a handout, rather than actual veterans of the Army. He opposed the legislation. Hoover said, no, you get your bonus when you get your bonus. But he did say, whether or not they're frauds, they are constitutionally demonstrating. And he also said, this does look like a mob assembling in the Capitol. Maybe I should try to appease them. So he supported their right to a peaceful assembly, and Hoover even provided food and supplies, an ability to go erect a shanty town within sight of the Capitol. On June 17th of that year, the Senate voted down the Patton bill. It failed. And Hoover said, okay, bonus Army, I'm glad you guys are here to go show your support, but your bill lost, time to go home. And then the Army refused to leave. The bonus Army just refused to leave. Some did, most probably did actually, but approximately 2,000 hoped to meet with the president, hoped to force his support, and they refused to budge. Hoover then sent in a general of the Army, a guy named Douglas MacArthur. And remember his name, he's going to be important in our story later. Hoover sent in Douglas MacArthur to peacefully restrain, but to disperse the protesters. Subpoint B. General MacArthur, in what will be kind of known as a classic MacArthur move, exceeded his orders. He commanded an infantry regiment. Another name that's worth knowing, General Patton, led a cavalry regiment and 6 battle tanks to go monitor the bonus Army protests. The bonus marchers believed, okay, so MacArthur and Patton bring in the actual army to go push out the bonus Army. The bonus Army are U.S. veterans, and they see the Army coming in, and their thought is, hey, Army, same side, right? Like, we're veterans of you. Like, this is great. And they get really excited, believing that they were coming in to come support them and march in their honor. And they cheered the troops until Patton ordered the cavalry to charge. When he orders the cavalry to charge, that's an action which prompted the spectators to say, whoa, whoa, shame. This is like, you should not charge on us, cavalry. We are Americans. You can't send in the American army to go charge on veterans of our own army. After the cavalry charged, the infantry fixed their bayonets. They tear gassed the crowd. They entered army camps, into the bonus Army camps, evicting veterans and families and camp protesters. Hoover's like, whoa, MacArthur, I said peaceful dispersion. He ordered the attack stopped. MacArthur's like, oh, can't hear you, President, and just kept, ordered a new attack, claiming the bonus Army was an attempt to overthrow the government. In the course of the operation, the infantry tear gassed 1,000 people. A 12-week-old baby was encamped with his family there. He died in a hospital. An investigation said he died of enteritis. A hospital spokesman said the tear gas didn't do it any good, probably aggravated the condition. An 8-year-old boy ended up partially blinded from an attack. 2 people were shot. A lot of people were injured. Most Americans were stunned and outraged at the way that the U.S. government would treat their own U.S. veterans. Once again, Hoover's image suffered. And he suffers while an election is nearing. Democrat Franklin Roosevelt was going to run against him. When Roosevelt heard about the attack, he kind of quipped. He's like, well, this will elect me. The downturn in the economy and Hoover's inability to deal effectively with the Depression really sealed his political fate. Subpoint C. Economist John Maynard Keynes believed that when a country's economy was stagnating, and it appears now that America's economy is stagnating, the government should do what was called counter-cyclical spending. And that's what they should just spend money. The government should just say, okay, the economy is tanking, the government should just spend money and go put people to work. To stimulate the economy. Keynes was very influential in the United States from the 20s through the 40s along the way. Hoover was pretty cautious of this Keynesian idea, saying, he's like, I'm not sure that's a proper role of government, but even though he's cautious, he put counter-cyclical economics into place. He proceeded slowly, but proceeded. Economists differed over the idea of counter-cyclical spending. They still differ over the idea of counter-cyclical spending. But Hoover experimented with programs and received a lot of the blame from both sides of not being aggressive enough with the Keynesian stimulus or by using it at all. Hoover was kind of caught in the middle of it. He, as a person, philosophically, he actually, he opposed welfare. Hoover didn't like the idea of direct relief, of just handouts of cash. He was strongly committed to associational action. He says, Americans need to take care of other Americans. I mean, that's the model he used in the European Relief Fund after World War I. He's like, that's charity, not government handouts. Hoover had a long career of helping people. He was a humanitarian, but he thought radical charity is what it called for, not government handouts. Hoover's Treasury Secretary was Andrew Mellon. And Mellon, his approach is totally different. Mellon is basically like, let them fail, to heck with them. You know, he wanted to take the Depression the same way that depressions had always been handled. So it's a severe depression. Okay, he said liquidate labor. You know, sell them off. Labor fails. Liquidate labor. Liquidate stocks. Liquidate farmers. Liquidate real estate. Which sounds like a terrible smoothie. He said, it will purge the rottenness out of the system. The high cost of living, the high costs of high living will come down. People will work harder. They'll live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted. Enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from less competent people. Mellon's way of handling it is essentially the way that America handled the depressions before, like the one in 1920 and 1921. Believers in free enterprise tend to credit the laissez-faire, hands-off policies of government, and basically say that's what caused the boom of the 1920s. Hoover thought that's pretty tough medicine, and Hoover fired Mellon. So point D. While Hoover is not really one of the great Keynesian stimulus presidents, he does do a few things that are just kind of classic Keynesianism. He began construction on the Boulder Dam in 1931. It employed thousands of workers at a cost of $49 million. It built the largest dam in the world at a time. I'm kind of uncomfortable with calling this a dam. I teach at a Catholic school. I'm going to call it a dang it. Hoover began construction on the Boulder Dam in 1931, employing thousands of workers at the cost of $49 million to build the largest dang it in the world at the time. The Boulder Dam had caused a big lake to be built, Lake Mead, provide irrigation resources and electricity. Electricity that was generated by the Dang-It and its turbines provided electricity to Arizona, Nevada, and California, which would then be sold, right, because people have to go pay their power bills, and that would go pay off the cost of building the Boulder Dang-It. In 1932, Hoover also created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided loans to banks and railroads and other businesses along the way. Also that year was the Federal Home Loan Bank Association, which tried to lower the cost of home ownership. In 1932, Congress passes and Hoover signs the Glass-Steagall Act. And there's been a couple of Glass-Steagall Acts in history. This was the first one, with the goal of stopping deflation by helping the federal government make loans to banks. Deflation is kind of a curious piece of American, or of any kind of economics. We're pretty comfortable with the idea of inflation, that over time prices would go up. Deflation is over time that prices would come down. And while that sounds good for consumers, like things become cheaper, depending on what it is, deflation is disastrous. If you buy a house for $300,000 and 10 years later it's worth $200,000, that's a catastrophe in the economy. So to try to stop deflation along the way. With trade on life support, things got worse, and so Hoover began to just intervene more. He told businesses, hey, you got to quit firing people. We got to keep people on the payroll. He raised taxes 64% in an effort to go balance the budget. He brought in high taxes and high tariffs and lots of rules, and a lot of that red tape would go complicate the Great Depression. And then it's going to get worse, and then it's going to get like better and not better, and it's this question of how America is going to address the changing cultural situation, the changing economic situation, the political instability, the social instability. All of that's a fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you more about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone, raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression.